get part of our community, go to remoteaf.co, click the community button, join us on Discord. Lots of people talking about the very things we're talking about today. And in saying that, I've got a great guest, Craig Cockburn. How are you today?
Hi Tony, I'm fine, thanks. It's welcome from Scotland. It's not too bad weather today. It's been a bit on and off, but looking forward to having a chat and the feedback from the audience.
That'd be fantastic. Craig, let everybody know a little bit about yourself, because I know you well, but maybe some people don't.
So I currently work as a freelance agile coach, and I'm based out of Edinburgh, Scotland, which is this fine castle behind me, virtually. And I've really lived and worked in Scotland for most of my life, although I have spent some time in London, and my work has taken me around a bit. I'm currently finishing up a gig that's kind of hybrid, based at Dublin. I've worked from the north of Scotland up by Inverness to the south of England, and the odd trip abroad as well. And although I work now as an agile coach, my career goes back to the days of being a software engineer and team lead and test lead and project manager and program manager. And I really started to get into agile about 2006 using sort of lightweight practices, and then I went into agile coaching in about 2011 and largely been a full-time agile coach since 2018. And also since 2019 I've been doing a few conference talks, different sorts of topics, including remote working and blogging. And I'm also doing stuff on critical thinking, which is my other latest strand for the last 2 or 3 years. So quite an ongoing development of career. And I've been very interested in remote working since actually the late 80s, early 90s.
Yeah, so because it has been around that long, right? It's not new. It's
Mm,
just that
yeah.
it reached that flashpoint with obviously the pandemic. Um, I'll just approach the other one for those in here. He's not related as per se to Alistair Cockburn.
Well, I am actually
There
distantly.
you go.
Distantly, because Coburn's a place as such. The people with the Coburn name are likely to be related, but across hundreds of years.
There we go. Very good, very good. We both had the occasion to talk to Alistair quite often, so it's a bit of an in joke. So,
Yeah.
all right, let's move on. Let's talk about what we're here to talk about: work from home versus work from anywhere. We're just going to start with that. So,
Mhm.
how about you give me your definition of what the difference is between working from home and working from anywhere, Craig?
Well, really, I suppose like now I'm at home, but I've got a virtual background. I mean, my actual real wall is just plain white. It'd be very boring. But in theory, I could be kind of on holiday. I could be anywhere. I mean, there's a whole load of great stuff that can happen there. You know, if my wife and I wanted to spend some lovely time in the northwest of Scotland, I could do a bit of work during the day. She could, pop out, and then we could go out in the evening and we'd be by the beach. It's all that flexibility. Now, it's great to have that work from anywhere. There is, and as a freelancer, it should really just be up to me to sort out the nuts and bolts of making that work, like the visas, the tax arrangements where necessary, like all to be compliant. But sometimes big organizations want to say, oh no, you can only work from here, or you can only do it in this country, and all this sort of stuff. So yeah, with it around Britain, no problem. But as soon as I start going somewhere else, it's an issue. And even, as despite all the politics of Brexit and it's difficult to work in the EU, I can still work in Ireland and I can go there, and I've been going there. But when I, put out, I'm looking for work, my current gig's currently ending, but when I put out that I'm looking for work and I say, I'm very interested in working in Ireland, of course there's no visa issue because it's an open border between Britain and Ireland. I still have barriers. I still say, yes, although we are Ireland based and although we support working from home, that home must be in Ireland. You can't do it in Britain, even though you've got the entitlement to work in both countries, because they're just not geared up to things like the tax differences and the legislation. And it's a real barrier that actually the whole ethic about it's about me and my responsibilities, and I just sort that out myself rather than workplaces just getting in the way. So there's a few challenges there.
It's really become sort of a very hot topic because
Mm.
so work from home. A lot of organisations, as you say, generally you can work from home.
Yeah.
Uh, and then the thing about you working from anywhere, they start to say, well, no, that's not the case. But now what's happening with that is even a bigger push is, is that forced return to office over the top, right?
Yeah.
And how are you seeing that operating with people? Because I can see that it's doing a lot of damage to human psyche, and even the damage to the environmental piece as well.
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole lot around that, and it's quite a prominent discussion on LinkedIn often, because remote working didn't just start with the pandemic, right? I mean, I was I was into this early because I actually was working for the world's largest networking company in the 1980s, and we had a terminal at home, so we could work from home, and it was handy for out of hours, and it was handy for like women who didn't want to be in the office late and getting back late and all that. It created all that flexibility, and it was great. And so that's been a thing for a while, and there were many people doing it, and it was particularly useful, especially as I found out for disabled people in the early 80s. And so there was always that community and it was growing. But then this forced you must work from home because of the pandemic really just shifted the whole perception. We learned that actually, key workers needed to keep on doing their jobs. And my wife's a teacher and she was doing remote work. We knew it worked, despite the fact that we were so new at it. Many of us didn't have that experience. Many of the tools weren't set up. Much of the infrastructure even wasn't really set up for all those people channeling the traffic to the office and then back out again. So some of the networks didn't quite work. But despite all those problems, we knew actually that it worked. And it was a huge success, despite it being a very difficult time psychologically for many people, and with health reasons and caring responsibilities for family. Despite all of that, it was still a success in many levels, and it just really suited many people, because it was especially good if you've got caring responsibilities and children and all these things. And I was a single father for a year too, so I can definitely relate to all of that as well as of course cutting down on the cost, because with inflation and rising fuel prices and all this, the cost is a big factor in trying to balance it. So massive things. And so when people do it and they realize it works and they've seen it working, there's then that adjustment. And Chris Hare talks a lot about this as well. He talks about quality of life, in which work is part of that, rather than us handing over our lives to work in the way that I unfortunately had to do when I was getting up at 3 o'clock in the morning to catch a 6 o'clock flight and spending 4
Yeah.
nights in a hotel in London, and all that's just rubbish, right? And it's bad for the environment. So now we're seeing this. People have the experience of it working, but we've got big bosses calling everybody back to the office. And when we see this debate play out, we see, oh yes, and so's called them back. But then months later, it's actually not really happened because people have just said no. And bosses can't just afford to sack large numbers of people, and people say no. And of course, people like me who have a disability have legal rights. We say, but you have to be able to make a reasonable adjustment. And if you've got caring responsibilities, you've got rights. So the law does play into this a little bit, and people with unions are supported to say, look, it's all very well to say, but what does the boss want? But it's actually what people are entitled to and what people want that matter, because ultimately the market will decide, and people will then migrate to more inclusive employers that reflect people's needs. People know themselves where they are best working, not the boss. And it's often this over centralized control. Or, of course, the other thing is people with property investments and portfolios in the cities seeing all this underutilized office space. And of course, what's actually happens with that in the longer term is that if it's underutilized office space, often the people that really call the shots in organizations are not the CEO, they're the shareholders. And if the shareholders want that bigger return on their investment, they go, you're hiding that big expensive office in the city. You don't need that anymore, do you? Really, you better downsize. And then the boss just doesn't get their way because the shareholders are saying, why are we spending money on an underutilized asset in an expensive place? And why is all the staff churn happening? So there's lots of different levels of dynamic going on. But now I've now just started calling it out and saying, look, don't get into all the big long detail or the big long arguments. Just call it out and say, as an organization, do you have environmental goals? Right? You almost certainly do. How does all this commuting unnecessarily align to that? It just doesn't. You've also got inclusive goals, and you want to be an inclusive leader. So how does all this mandated 3 days in the office align to that? It doesn't. Let people decide. Some people like the office, some people don't. But this, you've got to be in the office 3 days a week, effectively mandates that people must live near the office. So therefore, that is a cost because you then need to live within commuting distance. And we know that commuting distance in big cities adds to cost. And it means that people are then potentially disconnected from the place where they grew up, where they may have family networks that can support them with childcare. And so it's just a really it's a 19th century factory mentality of you can only be in the office and be present, and we'll give you a concession of 1 or 2 days remote if you want to take that up. It's just another form of control, right? And people recognize that.
So let me play the black hat, although I see a comment there from Scott Ferguson that I put up on the screen for you there. So that's an interesting one.
Yeah, we can do other things with the city centre. We can change them from offices to actually places where people live. Now in Edinburgh, it's quite unusual. There's a lot of people do live in Edinburgh city centre. That's quite unusual because I've been in London. Hardly anybody lives in the city of London. And it's just like, look at what's happened to our cities. We're complaining about the death of the high street. Well, guess what? If people lived in the high street and round the corner from the high street and could afford to live there would be more of a high street.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? We're seeing that here in Australia as well. So the CBDs are calling, and you can see that the CBDs are suffering. But again, like you said, it's been centralised like that because there was such a mass amount of people. Now, what I believe with it is that it'll decentralise itself, and you see the revitalisation of the communities. But let me play black hat for a minute, all right? So I'll do the black hat piece. People just simply aren't as productive when they're working from home. That's what we hear all the time, Craig. What's your thoughts on that? Don't shoot the messenger. I'm just, I'm on your side, really. But
Well, we hear it, and I always say, okay, show me the data. Now one person doesn't really prove the argument. It could be just like, in the office isn't best for everybody. It could be that at home, maybe there is the odd person that takes advantage of it, takes the mickey and does 3 jobs and doesn't tell you. Right, fine. But the general people that you work with and that are productive, agile, checking in with everybody every day. Right? You have your morning call or your daily scrum, and you see up the structures for transparency and collaboration. People are doing. And actually, it's not about have you done your hours. It's not about have you done your timesheet. It's not about those things. It's have we made the difference to the business? Have we delivered the outcomes? And that's really the change in focus. So if you're an organization and you're so obsessed with things like, let's face it, body language, when was that a thing? Right? It wasn't a thing in the 90s when we had all this telephone and remote stuff and no video. And now they're obsessed about people are not productive. Well, show me your productivity stats in the office because I bet you had them. Oh no, wait a minute. No, you didn't. All you had was timesheets completed, right? So and you had late projects. So show me the data. Show me the data that's telling you that remote working isn't working to the point where it's a justification you must stop it for everybody. That's the issue. It's like, of course you get performance issues with people all the time, but manage them rather than managing and constraining the system and making it bad for the people who are actually making it a success for themselves and a success for the organization too. Show me the data.
Yeah. So the other thing that you see then when you ask those questions, and I've seen this and I've had these conversations, is now there's monitoring software because I need to know where my people are, when they're working, how they're working, and I need to know that they're actually being productive. I'll give you the data because I'm going to do that to my people. So that to me is probably one of the worst advents that I've seen in a period of time. Have you had experience with that? Thoughts on it?
Well, I've not had that software in my machine myself because as a contractor, it's my equipment, right? So I wouldn't want that on my stuff anyway. I've heard about it, and it's deeply troubling, And it's this invasion in people's homes and an obsession with every keystroke, and an obsession with just looking busy, and we've heard about the stories about the mouse jiggling devices that make your mouse move and it looks like that. For goodness sake, if you're spending your time as a manager focused on that rather than the outcome for your customers, maybe you shouldn't be a manager, right? Maybe it's about you.
Yeah, I agree with you. Unfortunately, the damage that it's doing to people is interesting, because then you do have people who are just acquiescing and saying, "Well, I'll come back into the office because I'm being forced into that." So
Yeah, I mean, we do know that there's vulnerability, and obviously in a time of recession, people don't want to be seen as doing something that might make them more exposed to being laid off, because there is layoffs happening, and that correlation between, oh yeah, these people didn't want to come back to the office, maybe they'll be selected for the next round. It's pretty dysfunctional, to be honest. It really is deeply dysfunctional, because as a manager, if you do need to sadly make cutbacks, you should be cutting back on what the business doesn't need, rather than people that don't comply with your command and control way of thinking. Because guess what? In the future, we need less command and control. We need more collaborative leadership, and we need more great leaders. And so what happens is, if you impose the wrong management style on people, the best people leave, because they know that they're not going to get on with you, and they know that they will find work somewhere else. So dysfunctional management means that people leave the managers rather than the work. And if people leave the managers, they'll find a better manager, and it won't be you.
yeah, and I guess the thing, there's a couple of things we talk about here. Obviously, at Remote AF, we're quite focused on that. Your home is in your work, and your work is in your home now. And so you have to be cognizant of the fact that means people are actually much more at home at working, and they're much more relaxed, and they're in a setting where it allows them to do things. But it's a double-edged sword for the employer as well. If you think that forcing people to come into work or doing that, don't forget that means that people across the world have access to the talent that you're actually putting to the right. What's your thoughts on that?
Well, it's not just across the world, but imagine like you're working for a dysfunctional bank in the city, and they say you have to be in 3 days a week. Guess what? In the city, there's other banks. And if the other bank next door says, see all these people, you're coming into the office today, we're the big bank next door, and we don't make you come into the office, the staff will just get poached, because the staff will self-select where they want to work for. So it doesn't even have to be across the world. It could just be across the road, right? You are literally competing on a much bigger thing. And as I wrote a blog about remote working on LinkedIn in 2017, and I said, to be honest, unless if you provide the best workplace, then you're competing on being the best workplace, not the best workplace that happens to be within commuting distance, and you've got a captive, limited audience. And you know what? Unless you're a bad manager, you wouldn't really worry about that. Because if you're a good manager, you can attract the staff wherever they happen to be. But if you're a bad manager, you'll be worried about losing that control of, we're in a medium-sized city, we're the biggest employer, we call the shots, the next biggest employer is too far away, so we can more or less do what we like, and we can set the rules. You can't do that anymore, because people can work anywhere. And the opposite is also true, is that I was recently working for Admiral, which is one of the most respected and best employers in the UK. But they had a problem, because they're based in Cardiff, and Cardiff is not so easy to get to if you don't live in Wales. But nonetheless, they still invested in being a great place to work, and they really supported remote and flexible working very, very well. And to them, it opened up the possibility of people like me and others who were attracted to working there, but previously couldn't. And so rather than me just being limited to places in Edinburgh, I can now go to where the best work is. So it's now a competition for the best place to work, rather than your local. And if you don't like it here, you need to up sticks, take your kids out of school, and move hundreds of miles away, which people just didn't want to do ever.
Yeah, it's interesting, because I don't know if you've noticed, but we know, even here in Australia, there have been certain areas that have actually started to legislate.
Yeah.
To make that so that these things can't happen. So it is a right for the worker to be able to work at home. Do we need to go there, Craig?
Do I need to? What's that? Do need to go to legislation?
Yeah.
Well, it shouldn't be the case, but we have to live in a world where we know that not every employer is an enlightened employer, and not every leader is a great leader, and not every leader is an inclusive leader. You don't need the legislation for those people because they're just doing the right thing. But you do need it for the people that are not great leaders, so everybody's supported just as well. There's a comment there, I think, from Scott about home workers at BT, and it's very interesting because I was at BT, and I know, I think that the chief executive is just on his way out, and it was really, really odd at BT in the sense of we were all working remotely because we had to, because it was at that stage early in the pandemic and it was full lockdown. But at the same time, the chief executive was out there writing the puff pieces in the popular press about how he hated it. So you could just imagine how that's going to play out when people all over, the general public as well as employees, read that and go, the chief executive is really against remote working. Oh yeah, and by the way, we've just built a very, 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 very big, expensive office in London that we're committed to building and was halfway through just in the middle of the pandemic. So we're going to finish that anyway and make sure it's a success. So it's a lot of dynamics in the go there for, ironically, for an organization that was absolutely critical for the success of people in lockdown, because BT, part of BT is the arm of its organization Openreach, which basically runs the infrastructure on broadband in Britain. So it's like that was the organization that was, people were receiving awards from the royal family for their work in lockdown in setting up your telecoms networks for pop-up hospitals to work. Yet at the same time, the dysfunctional message from the CEO was, this isn't good, he doesn't like it, and you're all going back to the office. It was very much a mixed message, and it's just that people see that it's so transparent when your chief executive is speaking in the national media about it.
Yeah, it's definitely the sort of the thing that organisations, it's an interesting. I saw a remote working survey, and they were saying now that actually 70% of people now are looking to see whether organisations allow them to work remote, and that's jumped from 30% before the pandemic. So I know remote working, as we talked about, was around, but obviously people had more of a taste of it.
I think that the whole mentality, though, is like allowing remote working. Wait a minute, allowing? It's as if it's a treat or a perk. No, it's about inclusion.
Yeah.
Inclusion isn't a perk. The environment isn't a perk. Stop speaking about it like that. It's like the whole thinking, and it's like, yeah, and it's kind of like 3 days. The whole thinking about the weekly thing. If I have to work in London, it's still 2 flights. It's still the same environmental impact, whether I'm there for 2 days or 4 days. So the enlightened organizations that I work with that do encourage a bit of travel, it's for a purpose. It's maybe for quarterly planning, or it's maybe for a social thing, or it's maybe for team bonding, and it's intentional, not just turn up because we expect you to be in the office a certain. It's meaningful and it's purposeful, and you can have beers and pizza and social stuff and really just get to know people as people, but not as a regular habit you're sitting on the desk next to them. And that's the thinking that's different in the more enlightened organizations. It's get together for a purpose on a cadence that really makes some sense rather than just turn up for 3 days a week.
Yeah. I had the wonderful opportunity to have Kirsten Clasey on here, I think it was the week before last, and she works for Automatic, who were obviously have been, as they say, they were doing remote before it was cool. They're the company behind WordPress.
It's always been cool, Tony. It's always been cool.
But they talk about that as well, and there's another company, Redox. I had the Redox guys on as well, and they do some pretty good things. Like there's an acknowledgement that you do need to have a human recharge of getting people together. But as you said, I just want to pick up on that because you were saying about doing it purposefully, and that's what they do. And the reason they can afford to do that is because they don't actually have physical offices all over the place.
Yeah,
they're saving on that money they spend on rent or cost or all those kinds of things that go with owning those premises and running those premises. So to bring people together as a recharge and then has been fairly well documented that that's successful. Yet it still seems to be denied that there's money to be saved in not having the office space. And I think that is, you touched on it earlier, it's being pushed by the big.
Yeah. And if you're saving all that money by downsizing the office or making it smaller, you can do different things. You don't have to give it back to shareholders, but you could say, we're going to treat the employees to an employee experience and do more that people feel more engaged. It's not just about treats, and it's not just about equipment in the home, because of course you just need that to do your job anyway. It's about saying, as a company, we should be maybe having like employee days out, and all this kind of experiences that actually make people more part of that corporate community and connect better. I saw there's a comment about the enlightened firms. Now, yeah, so I mean, I worked for BT, and there was all that. Yeah, you've really got to be in the office, and of course, strategically for BT, Scotland didn't have one of those offices, so and I left, and of course, certainly within the City of London, a lot of the investment banks, in particular, are very poor at encouraging remote working, and we just have to call that out. As I say, like I've just been with Admiral, so they're in Cardiff, and they supported completely remote working. So when lockdown ended, they'd pivoted from we can only recruit from Cardiff to we can recruit from anywhere. And with the length of time that had happened, you can't just go back to saying you have to come into Cardiff, because there was people literally had been recruited from all over Britain who couldn't commute to Cardiff. So the structure had changed, therefore the organisation had to adapt, and they're a really inclusive leader. And latterly, I've been working for AIB in Dublin, and my experience was both working in the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland, as well as the north of Scotland, in these places that are more peripheral, farther away from London, in which I mean, I don't like the term remote, because they don't feel remote. They're from there, right? But in these away from the major financial centres, they were used to this. So when I wrote my blog in 2017, and I was working for Atos way up in Whisky Country near Inverness, they were used to it. They were used to people leaving at 3 o'clock in the afternoon to catch a flight. They were used to people having to make long commutes and the cost of that. They were used to it anyway. So we already had a kind of a 2 or 3 days on site and a 2 or 3 days remote, because they were just used to that, because they were in that type of location. So a lot of these more enlightened organizations are the ones that had the struggles originally, because they weren't in 8 million people cities, and they couldn't recruit because they were in a city that was 10,000 people. And so to get the people, they had to sort of think about, well, how do we scale up? How do we recruit? Because they're just not living around the corner, and they don't necessarily want to move here. So these were the companies that were more thinking around flexible remote working to start with.
Yeah, it's interesting. You see the organisations that are doing this now, and they're, as you said, enlightened. Which is,
I can't hear you at the minute, Tony.
Have we lost you, Craig? Testing. We may have lost Craig. Are you back?
No, I still can't hear you.
Well,
that's one of the problems. I'll unplug my headset back in again. Hang on, wait a minute.
Hey, well, this is what happens when you have live and you're right across the universe. So there you go. Let me know if you're back, Craig.
That's it. I can hear you now.
You can hear me now. There we go. Little tech issues, but that's fine. We can't edit that one out, but nobody saw it, so it doesn't matter, right?
Yeah.
What I was going to say was, what I'm calling out with organisations now, though, the other place that I see organisations playing the game, right? So we're going into this wonderful situation now of being allowed to work remote, but organisations are saving money on the fact that they're actually not providing the gear. So people are shelling out of their own pockets for their own microphones, their own TVs, their laptops, etc., chairs, desks. That that to me is
that's a funny thing, isn't it? I mean, in the past, the company provided the office, the desk, the equipment, all that. They should obviously continue to do that, because you don't want an uneven platform, right? What you don't want is some employees that have got a fair bit of money, they've got a great setup, fine. Some employees that don't have a bit of money, or even whatever, they don't have a great setup. That's uneven, and that's not inclusive. So everybody should have at least the same equivalent. Of course, if you want to buy more, that's your choice to make. But a decent monitor, especially a decent chair, because you're sitting a long time in it, and your back's really important. And to be honest, if you are at work, doing your work, but at home, then there's probably a legal responsibility from your employer to make sure that you can actually do your job and it's not affecting your health, because your employer is still responsible for your health when you're at work. David's just mentioned there about Jaguar Land Rover, and I know people there, and some people actually working remotely, and also some people work in other countries, and they get together only maybe every 2 or 3 months, so it does happen. But the whole supply your own equipment is really poor. As a contractor, I'm expected to do it. I'm fine with that. But as an employee, it's not a perk, it's a basic, and it's just a bit stingy if you're not doing that.
Yeah, and I think the companies that are doing it well and are quite, a few of them we've had on here, particularly, talking about Automatic and Redox are the ones that just come to my head very quickly because I spent some time talking to them. They actually provide, a stipend of X to allow you to go and buy what you need and set yourself up properly, right? And I think that...
Especially in touching on something that I was wanting to pick up earlier, it's about your own environment. Your own environment matters to you, right? Because it's in your home, and you know what works for you. But it's really, really, really important if you've got a disability, special needs, some like neurodiversity. You may need specialist equipment like the subtitling software or a special keyboard, and you just know what works for you, right? So expecting an office to provide that, especially if it's hot desking, which is absolutely the worst experience imaginable, you can't even figure out where your chair's configured in the morning. It's just about thinking about being an inclusive leader and providing people with the tools that they need to be effective, which is going to depend very much on the person and their individual needs.
Yeah, so we're a fully remote company, right? So the other thing that I see that organisations haven't quite come together to grapple to. So Remote AF, for example, we have an employee in London. I am, if you're listening. We have our founder is in France at the moment. I'm living on an island off the coast of Brisbane or off the coast of Queensland. And our CEO, well, he's in the centre of the capital because he's our important person, of course. But the reality of that is that we have all of these things in place, but we also use a lot of asynchronous work to be able to actually converse backwards and forwards. We film clips and things like that.
Yeah.
You see that organisations aren't investing in that either. They're expecting everybody to be on the screen every single moment of every single day. Thoughts?
Well, I think it's nice to see people on the screen. It's easier to interact with people. We do accept that in different countries, maybe the technology and the infrastructure is not as good, right? So there's an issue, but fundamentally fix the problem, right? I've worked in organizations where they supply the laptop for security reasons. Generally, that's works reasonably well. But if it's VDI, it's generally terrible. Sorry. It's just been consistently poor and unreliable. And it's so frustrating that then, because the technology setup and infrastructure is poor, people then go, well, I can't turn my camera on, it's not going to work, or Teams drops off, and all that kind of stuff. You just want to provide people with the tools and software so they can succeed. I mean, it's like thinking back to the days of the Agile Manifesto. It's just like provide people the tools to succeed and let them succeed and step back. And there's the two parts. There's the kind of speaking. This is face to face, by the way. I can see your face and you can see mine, and it's probably bigger and closer than it would be if we're across on different sides of a conference room. So to me, this is face to face, right? But the thinking of what's the organization going to be and look like, I would strongly encourage this. Have cameras on, have dynamic environments, have Mural and Miro and all these kind of whiteboarding tools and great teleconferencing and all that. But you also need to accept that in many organizations that are distributed around the world, there's different time zones. So you need a great way for asynchronous communication too. So provide the structure for that, whether it's Teams or whether it's the Slack or whatever, because asynchronous communication is a thing. People come and go, and as we saw, especially in lockdown, I just need to pop out and do the school run. Well, business carries on, but you don't want these people to lose out and want them to just pick up again on what was happening when they then returned with the kids.
We've got a nice question there from Tutu to add to that. I hope I pronounced that properly. Can you see that question? Because it's a bit big.
Yes.
Screen, yeah. Thoughts on
It's
that?
about the
So,
sustainability. Well, clearly that's a thing. And just only this week, I mean, I was at a conference. It just happened to be down the road, and I was supporting it kind of with the publicity and the evening events. But the thing is about that conference, which was Agile 2023, which is the annual conference of the Agile Alliance, and it's in North America, as an experiment, they decided to have 2 days in Edinburgh. And we worked out that was like tons and tons of saved carbon dioxide. It was about 1 million travel miles that were saved because it was over 100 people and it's 4,000 miles each way from here to Orlando. So very, very much. That was just one organization making that one decision. That's a huge impact to the environment. And one person making one decision in an organization to say you can work remotely or you don't have to do that long commute. It's these sorts of big impactful decisions that affect hundreds and hundreds of people by giving the flexibility out there. It's fantastic for the environment because even if you are commuting in a sustainable way by using public transport still burns carbon dioxide. It still costs energy to make the bus. It's still energy on the electric tram. It's still energy. It's obviously better than everything else. But unless you're walking or cycling, any saving is a saving, and especially if it's a long commute, and especially if it's a plane, and especially if it's a big event, then making that a regular thing versus a choice-based thing for intent is a vast saving. So you can then point to those savings in your sustainability policy and say, this is what we're doing, and look how we're succeeding.
So the other question we've got here from Tutu is, she says, I'm curious, are specific roles within the organisation suitable for remote working than working from the office?
Yeah, well, there is. I mean, we saw this with the key workers example in lockdown, that there were people who were permitted to travel because of their work, and the sorts of things that are, if it's a physical job, right? If you're physically looking after people or shipping physical goods, or you need to be in a physical place, like you're a chemist running a chemist shop, clearly you can't do that remotely. Now, my wife does teaching in person. In theory, she could do that remotely, but it's far better in person. But you've really just got to look at the job. For most of our jobs, it's like this. It's being on the phone, it's being on the internet, it's collaborating with people who aren't sitting next to us, and it's not shipping or handling actual product like the Amazon delivery guy or the chemist handing over medicines. Unless it's that, if it's more knowledge-based work and it's more just collaborating with people around the world. I mean, let's face it, organizations are set up to be distributed long before remote working. So you'd have to wonder why an executive would be against it if in the 1990s they offshored to India or some other place and go, well, you've set it up that way, mate, right? It's like, what's the point of me traveling 400 miles to London just to be on the phone to somebody in New York when I can just do that at home? So you kind of know if it's not touching physical things, it's probably suitable for remote.
Yeah, my wife's a nurse, so but I'll tell you now, even nursing has, because of the pandemic, a quotient of that has moved online. So they're able to actually triage and they're able to talk to people and decide whether they actually really need to go to the hospital, et cetera, et cetera. So those things have even changed. We wouldn't even thought of that before. So even in those quotients of thinking,
teaching, learning, augmented reality, virtual reality, they have a role too. Yeah, so it's not like it's either or necessarily. It's about the best blend for the work. So
great question there from John for you.
Right, okay. So the best first step you think a leader can take to support the people when navigating an executive demand for the return to office. So it sounds to me that the executive at the top is demanding it. Now, this comment about leaders exist at every level. You can be a leader of 8 people, you can be a leader of 800 people. Leadership is a behavior as well as a role. And I think that this is the challenge, is to say, look, I suppose ultimately the executive kind of runs the show in a sense. They don't really, because people can leave. We all know that. But it's trying to, I think, provide the quantitative feedback and qualitative feedback from the people and work as a leader with other leaders at your level to then build up the picture, to then present it back to the executive, and as I say, look, we appreciate, Mr. Executive or Mrs. Executive or whatever, you want this. But this is what your workforce that you're responsible for, that run your company in effect, because they're the ones doing the work. This is what will happen if you do this. Now, say critical thinking is one of my side things. There's a technique called pre-mortem, developed by Dr. Gary Klein, and the difference between a pre-mortem and a post-mortem is nobody had to die first. And the pre-mortem technique is imagine that the company has failed or the project has failed. Now work backwards to see the steps that led to that. And you can try this out. So let's just imagine that company with the executive has failed, and you work backwards. And you go, well, actually, one of the reasons that the company failed is their key people left. Well, we're not already on that road already. So presenting it as a real reality, because many of the companies that did fail, the Blockbusters and Kodaks of this world, they didn't fail because their business went away. They failed because they were disrupted by somebody who did their business better than they did. And so if you're in a business where you're competing with other companies, you're competing for your people and you're competing for your products and your services. So people can make two choices. They can either choose as an employee to go to another company, or they can choose as a customer to say, I would rather buy from them rather than them because I think that they're a more attractive organization and they're more in line with my ethical values. So there's a whole load of dynamics out there that are totally, completely outside the control of an executive. So sometimes executives have illusions of power and control well beyond. They're not kings of the medieval world anymore, and it's about in a proper organization there is challenge at every level. Constructive challenge based by facts and evidence wherever possible. So the thing for leaders is, yes, listen to your staff, but also to challenge upwards with evidence, such that executives make the best decisions, because we see the companies that failed, and that's because executives made the wrong decisions. Executives are not flawless. So you've got to support the executive in making the best decision, such that they don't lose face and whatever else, and that the company succeeds.
I've got one last question for you, Craig. So I'm going to poke. I'm going to poke the bear before we finish up.
The bear's always being poked, and that's a good thing.
So here's the question that came through. How do we do Agile in remote? So in other words, they're saying Agile doesn't work anymore. We're going to have to change the way we work because now you want to work remote. Thoughts?
Well, it's a claim without evidence. In many of these arguments about remote working, it's the people that support working have the evidence, and the people that don't support working make the sweeping, unsubstantiated changes, right, or unsubstantiated claims. And Agile, with the Agile Alliance and the Agile Manifesto, the people were discussing this remotely before the event. They got together intentionally for a 2-day event involving beer and skiing and all the other stuff. They wrote the values. They collaborated via wiki months later to produce the principles. One of the people in the Agile Manifesto actually invented the wiki. So, Agile itself originated out of people collaborating at a distance and coming together intentionally. And yes, of course, the principle says about face-to-face meeting in person, same room. But guess what? We didn't have the tools now, or the broadband now, or the tools, anything like that now. We didn't have video communication. We didn't have high-speed broadband. We didn't have any of that. So, of course, in the context of the day, that probably made a lot of sense. But it works. We've seen it working in lockdown. We've seen all the rise of tools, Zoom and Teams and Mural and Miro and all these other things. So of course it can work. So it's not really, an impediment to Agile. It's really are you supplying the people with the right culture and tooling and bandwidth and all the other things that make it work, and just letting them be people, because people have been collaborating at a distance for decades and decades. Politicians do it around the world all the time, right?
I knew I was poking the bear when I asked that question, by the way, because we'd already had the conversation about that off screen, so that was good. Look, we can squeeze one more question in, and you'll see there's a question there from David Thompson, and it's a very large question there, but I'll let you respond to it, and those that are watching, you can see that in the chat.
Dave Thompson, then.
Yeah. So you can see, all right. So you can see I'll phrase it so that we can see it. He's saying the fundamental issue is merely one of trust. And so whether you create the right infrastructure for folks to make the choice, how comfortable is it for them to work from home, hybrid office work, wherever it is, synchronous, asynchronous, the how's not tackling the why. You mentioned at the start that poor management, ineffective leadership, poor behaviors. So this is just exacerbates this. So one thing we talk about regularly is creating psychological safety to help build this trust, but not really how to do it. What's your comment to that, Craig?
Yeah, well, I think that trust is obviously a big thing. I mean, let's face it. If you don't trust your people and your way to say, because we don't trust the people that have to come into the office, it's not a great place to start as a leader. You have to really start from an assumption of trust. You've been through this extensive recruitment process and validation process and background checks process. You should trust by default to your people. And you know from the output that they create whether they are actually doing the job that they've been recruited to do. So start from a position of distrust is rather poor place as a leader. Having gone through all that, you're basically saying HR, you didn't do your job, right? And again, it's allow people to work in the place where they are most comfortable and most productive, which, if you've got mental health problems and you don't like being by yourself, of course the office may well be the best place for you. That's your choice to make, right? But it's not about tackling the why. You mentioned so it's poor behavior, and it just exacerbates this because management still wants that feeling of we're in control, and it's management that's got the problem, and not the employee that's been dysfunctional. So to create that psychological safety, well, you build it actually by spending time with people, and you can spend that time with them online. And often the best places I've worked at remotely, it's not just here's a meeting, here's a meeting, here's a meeting. It's here's a meeting, we've got time to talk. In the same way that in an office we would chat at the coffee, all this water cooler nonsense that's never happened in real life. People go for a coffee and they sit and have a coffee together, and they just talk as individuals, or they talk as individuals at lunch, and that it's not a meeting, but we're just talking as people. That's the thing that you need to intentionally set up with remote working, because it's not happening by default because we're all in the same place. So when you set that informal collaboration up and informal spaces up, then that builds trust through regularly seeing and talking to the people and getting to know them as people. Like, what did you do for the weekend? Oh, I see your dogs in the background, and what happened, and fun. And you're getting to know them as individuals, because that's where trust comes from, is knowing them as people rather than just people that turn up with their cameras off for a 15-minute stand-up in the morning. And the psychological safety arises, and there's a lot of tools that can actually support this. It's not just you talk about psychological safety and then it happens. It's, what are we doing as a tooling practice to make psychological safety work? Are we demonstrating the leadership principles? Are we demonstrating inclusion? Are we, when something goes wrong, how do we handle that? That's the practices that make psychological safety a reality, rather than just ticking a box and saying it's safe here, because it's not.
Craig, we can keep talking on this, but unfortunately, we've reached the end of our time, and I want to take a moment to thank all of the people who've interacted with us today. Also to say to you, if you're really enjoying it talking remote, don't forget remoteaf.co, click the community button, join us on Discord. We've got a great community there. There'll be more of these chats. Hang around for the next one, which is how to build an organization with an agile heart, which is Craig Brown, someone we both know quite well. That'll be the next one coming along. Craig Cockburn, I'd just like to thank you for spending the time with us today. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks a lot, then. And sorry for the technical problems, but it's a lot better with that than my train got cancelled. Which is, no environment is perfect, but you can deal with it quicker when it's online, right?